The historical site David and I visited was the Lockwood Mathews mansion located in what is currently Norwalk, Connecticut. We were drawn to this particular site because of the familiarity of its location, close to the Stepping Stones Museum, and the fact that it had a combination of families in its name, which is atypical. Other than this interest in the name and location, we had very little information on the mansion itself. Therefore, prior to our visiting it, we did some research about what we might find there. We discovered that the mansion had been constructed by an enormously wealthy man, Legrand Lockwood. He wanted to build it in his hometown of Norwalk, so he purchased the land it sits on in 1863, consisting of 33 acres of land. Lockwood commissioned Detlef Lenox, who was one of the premier architects of the era, to construct the mansion, who combined many classic Greek and contemporary features to form what was an unparalleled example of Second Empire architecture in America. Therefore, before arriving at the mansion, we expected it to be extremely grand and fashionable. After learning about the importance of the mansion's architecture, David and I became more and more curious about how its following owner, the Mathews family, either adapted or maintained the intended style and appearance. Also, we were interested in why this particular mansion could be considered an invaluable resource in the understanding of our nation's history. Our tour guide, who did not wish to be recorded, had an answer to this question, claiming that the quality of preservation distinguished this historical site from so many others. Present within the mansion are many of the original pieces of furniture, paintings, and various other decorations that once belonged to the Mathews and Lockwood family. An interesting piece of our tour that showed just how well preserved this mansion is was the security system installed within the house. Walking through what would have been Mrs. Lockwood's bedchamber, the floor of the entrance to the room was lined with metal wires. These, when turned on by Mr. Lockwood, would activate an alarm if someone were to step on them. Aside from being an amazing piece of pre-modern technology, I was shocked to find that such an old, now insignificant piece of the mansion could still be found perfectly intact. Another important part of our tour that remained consistent throughout the whole mansion was the presence and importance of the servants. Because servants were not supposed to be seen, the home had many servant bells incorporated within its walls which could call a servant to any room in the mansion. Interestingly, these bell systems frequently broke, so there would be anywhere from 2 to 5 servant bells installed in any given room. Surprisingly, the treatment of the servants was very good. The servant quarters was described as being of higher quality than the White House at the time because they were given running water, and each servant was provided her own room, because only women lived within the mansion. This means the mansion's servants were living in better conditions than the president at the time. Legrand Lockwood, the commissioner of the mansion, was born in Norwalk in 1820, but when he was only 11 years old, his father decided to seek out fortune in the garment industry, so he moved his family to New York. On June 9, 1842, Legrand married his wife, Anne Louise, who had also moved out of Norwalk, and they had 8 children together. At the age of 18, Legrand began to work as a clerk for the Corning and Company brokers, which eventually led to his extremely successful career on Wall Street. Not long after this, thanks to his success in railroad stock transactions, Lockwood was elected as the treasurer of the New York Stock Exchange. Between 1862 and 1863, he even went to Europe to sell U.S. war bonds to support the Union during the Civil War. All of this led to Lockwood becoming one of America's first millionaires. In 1863, Lockwood began work on the mansion, contracting Detlef Lenox and other leading decorating firms at the time to create the mansion. He imported artists and pieces of work from Europe, all to take part in the construction of his home. Not until 1868 did the family move into the mansion, at that time called Elm Park, when the work was almost done. However, on September 24th, 1869, the price of gold suddenly and dramatically dropped in what is called the Black Friday gold market crash. This financially bankrupted Lockwood and forced him to mortgage his Norwalk home, while also selling $10 million worth of stock. Following this, he tried to regain his Wall Street status to pay the mortgage, but in 1872 he contracted pneumonia and died that same year. Anne Louisa continued to pay the mortgage on the estate by selling many of its interior furnishings, but in 1874 she could not make the last payment of $90,000, and so the mansion was foreclosed upon. In 1876, Charles Mathews, who was also a wealthy merchant from New York, bought the Lockwood estate to be his family's summer home. In June, his wife Rebecca and their 4 children moved into the home. Because Mrs. Lockwood auctioned off so much of the interior furnishings, there was still a lot of work to be done. However, Mathews soon acquired many of the original pieces. Charles Mathews died from a stroke in May of 1879, but his family continued to live in the mansion for much time to come. When Mathews' eldest son, also named Charles Mathews, died in January of 1934, Florence Mathews, one of Mathews' daughters, became a full-time resident in the mansion until her death just 4 years later. Harold and the 2 daughters of Lily leased the estate in 1939 to the city of Norwalk, and eventually, in 1941, the city purchased it for park purposes. The history of this mansion shows just how important it is as a piece of American history because it exemplifies many aspects of the Gilded Age. Lockwood was a wealthy merchant who could afford unparalleled luxury, importing the best designers and craftsmen in the world. Not only this, but the mansion's history incorporates a major event in American history, the Black Friday Gold Crash, being a prime example of the effect this event had on the upper class. For any student, this site should be a recommended location because of all the work done to preserve and restore it. In the 1950s and 60s, there was a threat of demolition, coming so close that there are in fact holes in the cement in the basement for dynamite. Fortunately, though, the site became the Lockwood Mathews Mansion Museum in 1967 and the first National Historical Landmark in Norwalk in 1971. Even to this day, people are donating pieces of furniture that used to belong to the Lockwood family. For instance, on our tour, the guide pointed out a table and set of chairs that was generously donated by an anonymous person once he or she no longer found use in them. Overall, this mansion taught David and myself of the luxurious living style of the upper class, and especially the influx of money in the northern economy after the Civil War. This mansion truly is one of the best representations of the extent of the wealth of the North after the Civil War and during the Gilded Age.